Hi, and welcome everyone. It's so nice to see people in person and then of course people online as well. I think if we haven't asked already, we were going to ask if people could type in their name and where they're from into the chat so we can get an idea of who all is joining us. So this is the first time that we've been in person for our Alberti Center Colloquium series since 2020 for obvious reasons. So this is very, very exciting for us. And even more exciting that we have our Early Career Award winner, Dr. Ann Farrell, here to present with us. She's joining us from Brock University, just over the border, and she's going to be talking about a complex understanding of bullying perpetration, the role of individual, social, and environmental factors. So I am going to first go over a couple housekeeping things, and Bree and Stephanie will help me if I forget anything because it has been a while. But the talk will be about 45 minutes to an hour. And then we will leave time for questions, which people can type in the chat, and those in the room, please feel free to ask them. It's a really fascinating topic, so we hope there will be good discussion. We're also going to leave a few minutes for people to do an evaluation that Bree will send the link for. And that's only, I mean, we like your feedback no matter what, but you need to complete that if you want National Association of School Psychologists or NASS CPD, which you will get an hour of credit for this if you are looking for that. Any other housekeeping things I'm forgetting? No, there's food for people here, and hopefully our guests joining virtually can have some coffee or something on you, not on us. So sorry about that. So let me introduce Ann Farrell, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Child and Youth Studies at Brock University. Her research focuses on multidisciplinary understanding of bullying as a complex social problem, including individual, social, environmental, and cultural factors associated with youth bullying and violence. And by understanding these mechanisms, she hopes to help prevent bullying and violence and facilitate positive relationships among young people. Previously, she was a Banting postdoctoral fellow and SSHRC postdoc fellow at the University of Ottawa in Counseling Psychology Faculty of Education. She was also, as I've already mentioned, the recipient of the 2021 Alberti Center Early Career Award. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Farrell.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that nice introduction, and thank you for having me here today. I'm so excited to meet all of you, both in person and virtually, and I'm grateful to be able to share a little bit of my research today. And as Amanda mentioned, my talk is on a complex understanding of bullying perpetration and looking at individual, social, and environmental factors. So I am Ann. I'm an assistant professor at Brock University, and we're located just over the border, about an hour away. And yeah, I'm excited to share my research. So first I wanted to, change the slide. There we go. All right. So first I wanted to say a big thank you to everyone here at the Alberti Center, and Amanda and Bree, who really helped us organize this and was very welcoming and helpful in getting me here today. I also wanted to say thank you for the Early Career Award. I felt so grateful to be a part of this community of researchers, practitioners, so many people from all different areas who are working to help prevent bullying. And just seeing the group of previous recipients, I just felt very thankful to be a part of that community. And also wanted to say thank you to the, congratulations to the latest recipient, Dr. Hart. So hopefully I'll be able to maybe attend her talk next year. For my 3 learning objectives, I kind of wanted to set up how the talk is going to go. So first, I'm going to be talking about individual differences that might be related to bullying perpetration. So generally, I've been focusing on personality, temperament traits, but then my second learning objective is to see how these interact and work alongside different social and environmental factors. So we know that children and adolescents and young people are living in a social world. So what are these interactions for them? And then finally, I'm hoping that we can reflect on the implications of these findings to effectively mitigate these factors and also help prevent and reduce bullying perpetration in the long term. So the overarching perspective I have is this lifespan perspective, or this lifespan developmental perspective, meaning that we know that often one of the strongest predictor of future bullying behavior is previous bullying behavior. So often someone who's using bullying during adulthood, let's say in the workplace, probably has a history of having used it during their adolescence, maybe in high school, and also during childhood and elementary school. So if we know that there's this continuity in using bullying behavior, what can we do in order to prevent this earlier on in development? And if we do prevent this earlier on, hopefully we can prevent this kind of life course pathway of using bullying as well. So all of you are from the Alberti Center, I'm sure have many different experiences with children and youth and have been exposed to the definition of bullying. But I thought it might be still important to go over it just to make sure we're kind of all on the same page. And this is the definition that I've been using in my research, which is the idea that bullying is intentionally used behavior under the context of a power imbalance for some sort of self-gain. It can also be used repetitively. And it's this idea that someone who has more power, whether that's physical power or social power or psychological power, is using this to harm someone else. And we know it is a significant problem in the sense that anywhere between 30 to 40% of young people across the world are saying that they have been involved in experiences of bullying. And we know that there's a host of adverse outcomes related to victimization, mental health, physical health, academic achievement, and so forth. But we also see that bullying is related to some mixed outcomes with respect to perpetration. So those who are using bullying and engaging in those forms of behavior. So this mixed evidence suggests that, well, sometimes bullying is related to these social benefits for young people, in the sense that there's been so many great studies out there, cross-sectional, longitudinal, social network analysis, suggesting that some young people are using bullying as a means to have these social resources. So things like being popular or being socially dominant or having this social status. And there's other studies that have looked at this during adolescence, where now dating and romantic relationships come into play. And there's evidence suggesting that these forms of behavior are also related to bullying perpetration as well. And often perpetrators of bullying are seen to have these value characteristics, at least in adolescence or in those high school years. So they're seen as being like attractive, having kind of self-efficacy, or seen as good leaders. So if we know there's these kind of social benefits related to bullying, how are we going to prevent young people from using this behavior for these reasons? We also see that bullying is related to some social costs, suggesting that there could be some benefits, but also these costs, in the sense that in some of these studies, even though bullying can be related to dominance or popularity, sometimes these young people aren't necessarily well liked by their peers. And some research suggests it may be due partly to power. So higher power being related to things like being seen as more attractive or better leaders. But also we see that sometimes these attributes are related to experiencing victimization as well. So sometimes they're also targeted, and maybe this suggests kind of that competition for the social status or social resources of the school setting. So taking all of these into consideration, if we know there are some benefits, there are some costs, how can we best kind of understand the factors that contribute to using bullying for these reasons in order to help mitigate these factors? So the overarching research question that I've been trying to understand in my research is, what are the factors that contribute to bullying perpetration? So what are the contexts for why or when and who is using bullying behavior? So the broad framework that I've been applying in my research is Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. And I'm sure many of you have heard of this model. It is a popular model used to look at bullying, but also just more broadly child development. And it's this idea that at the center, we have a developing individual in all of their features. And then there are these nested systems that vary in proximity to that person. So at the immediate system, we've got that microsystem, and that includes like parents and families, but also peers and at schools. And then as we go further and further out, these are more distal factors. So looking at indirect environments in the exosystem, for instance. So places where maybe the young people aren't necessarily involved directly, but it can indirectly impact their more immediate systems as well. And then at those broadest levels, we've got these social and cultural values, which are seen as like blueprints for what's kind of expected or valued in society. And then the chronosystem or changes across time. So I'm really trying to understand at least a part of this kind of model of what are those individual features, but what are also those social contexts that are important for when and who uses bullying behavior. So I'm also not the first person to look at bullying from an ecological perspective. There are some great research studies out there that have conducted this. And one of the review papers conducted by Hong Espelage in 2012 is a great review paper that really outlines a lot of the factors that may be specific to bullying. So starting at that individual and their features, there's things like age and gender and race and ethnicity, but also health status. So mental health, physical health. And then we see at the microsystem, of course, parents and peers and school factors are important for bullying. But they also outlined in the mesosystem that interaction between teachers and peers or teachers and parents are also important. And then at the broader levels, we've got that neighborhood climate. We've got those cultural beliefs and kind of structures that are in society that might also contribute to using bullying behavior as well. And then any sort of changes in that individual's life or their family structure, for example. So really a great review that I have referred to a lot and really kind of helped set the stage for a lot of these systems that are important for maybe contributing to both perpetration and victimization. So we also know that it gets quite complex. So it's not just this direct kind of linear association of these factors in bullying, but there are moderating and mediating factors. So again, so many amazing research studies out there that have looked at this. Moderating factors, looking at that interaction. So there's a study by Caravita and colleagues looking at that interaction between an individual's empathy levels, but also their social status and how does that impact bullying. We also see great work by researchers from the Alberti Center looking at things like school climate or peer relationships acting as moderators. And then there's also mediating factors, meaning what are those indirect pathways? So some studies on things like delinquency as linking bullying to other environmental factors, the role of emotion regulation skills as being an indirect mechanism. And then to get even more complex, you can look at between and within person effects. So what's happening between people, who's higher in bullying, who's lower, but also what's happening within a person, how is their own level of bullying changing across time. So really there are so many factors that are at play, and hopefully with my research, I'll just capture one piece of it that can contribute to this amazing field of work that other people have started. So starting at the center of this system, a lot of my research has focused on individual differences with respect to personality and temperament. So what are these traits looking like, and who's using bullying behavior? So that first question I've tried to address is, what are the individual differences that contribute to bullying perpetration among youth? So what are these traits looking like? Are they higher levels? Are they lower levels? And more broadly, what are these traits and what are these individual differences for who is using bullying behavior? So that's that first learning objective of my presentation today. And the reason why I was interested in this is because we generally see these individual differences or personality or temperament traits as being stable. And there is a lot of evidence for that, in particular, this rank order stability, meaning generally, if you're higher than me on empathy, let's say today, you're probably going to maintain that rank ordering and be higher than me 10 years from now. But what we see is that these levels can also vary across different developmental periods. And a lot of research is suggesting that maybe adolescence is a time when we can see some of these changes, because there are so many physical changes, social changes, and psychological changes that are occurring. And what's really interesting to me is that that's also that developmental period where we see peak in prevalence rates of bullying. So I'm very curious to know, well, how do these traits kind of develop alongside bullying perpetration and engagement in bullying? So some of the research on bullying and personality or individual differences suggests that they both have this kind of partially genetic component, but they're both impacted by social and environmental contexts as well. So they have that in common. Some researchers suggest, well, maybe bullying is one form of behaviorally expressing a personality trait, and maybe that's why they're related. And it's this idea that maybe someone who has a given level of a trait is probably more likely to use bullying than someone who maybe not necessarily as high in that trait. So whether at this conscious level or non-conscious level, someone with given set of traits may be more likely to kind of see, well, are there going to be benefits or costs to me using bullying behavior? And that might vary across people as well. So that's kind of the idea of why I was really interested in looking at these traits with bullying behavior. And again, so many great studies out there that have looked at a whole variety of personality and temperament traits in relation to bullying. And these studies have shown things like being higher in callous unemotional traits or lower in effortful control as being related to bullying. We see a lack of empathy, both empathic concern and perspective taking. In models of personality looking at the dark triad, we see that generally these traits are also related to bullying. And in general models of personality like the Big Five or Hexacode, we also see that lower agreeableness and lower honesty, humility are related to bullying. So really so many great studies out there that have found these associations and what traits are related to bullying perpetration or the use of bullying. So overall, these studies kind of suggest this idea of, well, if you're higher on these traits or kind of like these antisocial tendencies, then maybe you're higher in using bullying perpetration, so higher in levels of both. So that's kind of the general direction that is suggested based on all of those studies. But we know that not all young people are the same. So maybe on average, higher levels of these antisocial tendencies are related to higher levels of bullying perpetration. But we know there could be these distinct patterns or heterogeneous combinations, meaning that, well, some people could be higher on these traits, but maybe they're not using bullying. Or maybe some people are lower on these traits, but they're using bullying. Or perhaps they're both low in both of these traits and bullying. So this suggests, well, maybe there are these unique developmental pathways that we also have to take into consideration to understand the complexity of when and who is using bullying behavior. So we've already seen this in many studies with bullying perpetration and victimization. And some of these studies, depending on which one you look at, they found different percentages, but many of these studies have found there's these distinct developmental pathways for bullying and victimization as well. So the majority of young people may be using low levels of bullying or not really engaging in bullying, but a smaller percentage might be following moderate to high levels across, let's say, childhood or adolescence, depending on the study. We also see this unique pattern with victimization as well, where the majority follow low levels, but some individuals, a smaller percentage, can follow moderate to high or high to decreasing. So we see these unique patterns in bullying alone. And you can also start to see this evidence of a developmental pathway in the sense that generally experiences with victimization predict perpetration rather than the reverse. So if we can see this with bullying, perpetration, and victimization, what can we see when we look at these patterns with other factors that might contribute to bullying, such as personality development? So there was a really interesting study that was conducted in 2016, where the researchers followed young people across 3 years, starting from age 10, and followed them annually. And they looked at bullying perpetration along with this narcissism personality trait. So this is narcissism in the sense of just general personality, not any sort of diagnosis or anything like that, just the trait that everyone would kind of be varying on. And at higher ends, it captures the idea of kind of entitlement or superiority, which has previously been found to predict bullying perpetration. So they looked at whether they can find unique combinations of narcissism with bullying. And they found many different groups, but for the purposes of this presentation, I just wanted to focus on a few that I thought would be really interesting. One being this low risk group, where they found low levels of bullying combined with low levels of narcissism. And they found a high risk group that had high levels of bullying combined with high levels of narcissism. And this was only about 4 to 6%, depending on the form of bullying they looked at. And in their study, they were all boys. So this study was interesting because they were able to show these unique combinations. And in this study, they found stability across all their groups. So if you were high in narcissism or high in bullying, they were stable across those 3 years. So this study kind of inspired me to think about, well, what do we see along a longer time span? Do we see any evidence for change in personality? Do we see it being related to changes in bullying as well? So this led to a study that I conducted with Tracy Vinecourt at the University of Ottawa, where we looked at narcissism along with bullying across 6 years of adolescence from age 13 to 18. So they were in grade 7 when they started, and this was a sample from Canada, and they were in grade 12 when they, at the last time point in this study. So what we wanted to see was, well, would we find similar trajectory groups? So would we find similar kind of high, low, medium patterns? And also, would we see any evidence for change across this period? And we thought we would find like a high group and a low group as well, but we really weren't sure about what we would see for change because of the literature suggesting, well, personality is probably more stable. And we also wanted to see, were these groups unique in those earlier temperament traits? So in this study, we looked at ages 10 to 12, and we were trying to see, would any of these temperament traits early in development predict these trajectory groups and whether these groups are stable or whether they're changing. So the data came from the McMaster Teen Study, which is an ongoing longitudinal study by Tracy Vinecourt, and it follows a cohort of young people from age 10 until age 24. So they've been followed annually. And they were representative of the school district from which they were recruited from in Ontario in Canada, and they completed these measures annually every year. So for our analysis, what we did was what's known as a Layton class analysis, which really just tries to look to see, are there distinct developmental patterns? Are there subgroups of people who follow similar patterns? So we conducted this for bullying and narcissism separately, and then we combined them together to see what's going on across the two. So for bullying, we found two trajectory groups, a high group and a low group. And the low group was decreasing and the high group was stable. So if they were high on bullying, they kind of stayed relatively stable from age 13 to 18. So we called them high in relation to the low group. But if you look, the mean levels on that kind of potential range was actually quite low, which I guess would be a good thing. So we looked at bullying first, and then we looked at narcissism. And similar to that study done in 2016, we found three trajectory groups, like a high, medium, low. But what was really interesting for us was that that high group actually showed increasing levels across time. So there was some evidence for change in personality during adolescence. So we wanted to see how would these groups be related to the bullying groups. And we looked at every combination. So who's high in bullying and high in narcissism, who's high in bullying and moderate, and so forth. But again, for today, I'm just going to focus on a few of the kind of interesting groups. So we found a low risk group like that 2016 study, and it was about 19%. So low in bullying, low in narcissism. We found a high risk group, so that high stable bullying and high increasing narcissism. And similarly, we found 6%. And we found what we called an at-risk group in the sense that they were high in bullying, but they were moderate in narcissism. And we tried to see, were there any early predictors of these groups? So if we know some of these early temperament traits to look out for, then perhaps there's something we could do to prevent bullying and these developmental patterns. And what we found was that this high risk group, at least relative to the low risk group, were lower on anxiety at age 10 and 11. And that was kind of interesting because generally low anxiety is seen as a good thing, but maybe this suggests something about, is it something about that low anxiety, low worry or fear, perhaps, that's related to bullying and these kind of narcissistic traits? And the at-risk group we found were predicted by higher hyperactivity and lower empathy. So these two groups had unique predictors when compared to their peers, but they actually weren't different from one another with respect to the early predictors. We also found some sex differences with these groups. So there were more boys than girls in the narcissism-only group, meaning that they were low in bullying but high in narcissism. And there were more girls than boys in the low-risk group. So pretty consistent with previous personality bullying research. And additionally, we found that high bullying was a better indicator of high or moderate narcissism than the reverse. So this is kind of suggesting that individuals who are using bullying are probably, they're more likely to be higher on narcissism, but just because you're high in narcissism doesn't necessarily mean you're using bullying behavior. So that was kind of interesting in showing these patterns and how they're related to one another. And we thought that this study kind of had a few key conclusions to take away. So it's consistent with previous studies that showed support for heterogeneity or unique developmental patterns for both bullying and narcissism, kind of like that 2016 study. But we were also able to see evidence for change in personality. So if this is a developmental period where maybe there are more kind of factors contributing to personality and bullying, that could potentially provide a route to some bullying prevention practices. We also found that bullying was a better indicator of narcissism, suggesting that maybe bullying can be this kind of behavioral expression of certain individual differences. But just because you're higher on certain traits doesn't necessarily mean you're going to use bullying behavior. So that also kind of led to the question of, well, what other factors are really into play? And we found that those two at-risk groups differed in those earlier temperament predictors from the low-risk group, but not from one another. So maybe targeting things like emotion regulation and trying to have more sensitivity towards others might be important routes for prevention in the long term. And it's generally consistent with previous personality literature suggesting things like low anxiety or more kind of callous, low empathy traits being related to bullying perpetration as well. And really kind of the takeaway from this study is that, well, not all young people are the same. There can be unique developmental pathways, and that's something that maybe we need to keep in mind in trying to think about how we can make prevention and intervention practices more effective. And potentially they could have been missed, these patterns could have been missed if we continue to use these more variable-centered approaches. And so really highlighting that it's important to think about the unique developmental patterns and how we can best capture and best prevent bullying. So we had this idea that, okay, so we found unique patterns with the narcissism, one personality trait that has been related to bullying in the past. And we're seeing that for some people who use bullying, they're kind of after those social rewards like popularity or status. So we wanted to see, well, what other traits would be related to this? And one that we thought of would be competitiveness, but in particular, hypercompetitiveness. Because if you are trying to go after those social resources, then maybe you're trying to outcompete other people amongst your peers to obtain those goals and get that power related to bullying. So we specifically looked at hypercompetitiveness with bullying using similar methods. So for this type of competitiveness, it's really looking at that winning at all costs, outcompeting others, which is different than competing to, let's say, excel or master a set of goals for your own kind of enhancement. So we were trying to focus more so on this aspect of hypercompetitiveness. And again, we were finding similar patterns. We found 3 trajectory groups for competitiveness. And again, it was only that high group that was increasing. So another unique feature of this study was that we used parent-reported competitiveness of their child or youth, and we're still finding similar patterns. So then we looked at competitiveness with bullying again to see, well, what kind of groups came out. And we found these similar trajectory groups, although the sizes were somewhat different. So we found that high risk, kind of high bullying, high competitiveness group was about 9%. We found that low risk group again. And one that was really interesting was we found this competitive only group, meaning again, they're higher on competitiveness, but they're not using bullying behavior. So this kind of made me wonder, well, we found 2 high competitiveness groups, but only one of them is using bullying. So what is the difference between these 2 groups? Why is it that some young people are using bullying and others are not, even though they have these similar personality or individual differences? So I think this really speaks to the idea of the social context or the environment matters. So for that high risk group only, we found that at age 10 and 11, they reported lower levels of family functioning and lower levels of school climate. And we did not find this effect for that competitive only group who wasn't using bullying. So it's showing that, yes, these individual differences are important because maybe certain traits are related to bullying, but that social context can contribute to when bullying is used or when perhaps bullying is seen as more advantageous versus more costly to be used in. And if we do know these patterns, perhaps that can also contribute to prevention in trying to shape certain environmental climates to be more pro-social or more cooperative, for instance. So this kind of leads to that next level of incorporating these social environments. We know that young people spend most of their time at school with their peers or at homes with their families. So what's going on in these environmental factors and how they're connected that are important for understanding bullying behavior. So how do these individual differences work alongside these social and environmental factors? And that leads to the second learning objective of how are they related both directly, but also how are they indirectly related to bullying as well? Do they impact one another? Or are there these direct associations? So in this study that I conducted with Tracy Feincourt and Tony Volk, who is also at Brock University in Child and Youth Studies, we looked at empathy and exploitation as two personality traits often related to bullying in previous studies, but we also wanted to look at how young people perceive their own social status and their own school climate. And we're trying to see, are there these direct pathways or are there these indirect pathways? And I think that perception piece is important because how young people perceive their social environment is going to impact how they respond or interact with it. So in this study, we looked at empathy. So specifically, we looked at empathic concern and exploitativeness, along with bullying perpetration across grades 9 to 11, which would be ages 15 to 17. And we expected that there would be these kind of previously found direct associations. So lower empathy with bullying, maybe higher exploitativeness with bullying. But we also wanted to see, are there any indirect pathways or direct pathways with these social factors? So social status and school climate. So we did a panel model where we have each of these variables across grades 9, 10, and 11, with the exception of empathy, which was stopped being measured in the larger study. So that's why there's a space up there. But we wanted to see if we control for all of those pathways, all of those direct effects, all of those within time associations, what really comes out as being important direct and indirect effects. So we did control for all of these associations, but I'm only going to be focusing on some of the key patterns that we found. So we found that lower grade 9 empathy was related to higher social status. So again, kind of supporting that idea that was previously found. We also found that poorer school climate or lower school climate was also related to higher social status. So among those three, they're having their own direct effects. But on top of that, we found an indirect pathway where higher social status in grade 9 was related to higher exploitative tendencies in grade 10, and that in turn was related to bullying in grade 11. So this indirect pathway of how kind of this social environment is related to personality, but also to bullying as well. So really trying to capture not only those direct pathways, but what's happening indirectly as well, because it seems that personality itself can also be impacted by the social environment, and that they can all have these indirect effects as well. So moving beyond those immediate systems, what is happening more at those macro level systems? So what's happening with the indirect environment or the social and cultural contexts? And I think that's also important to understand because schools and families and peers are all embedded within these larger systems. So what's happening at the larger level is going to impact those immediate systems and then the individual as well. So in this next study that I conducted with Tony Volk, we were trying to see how can we assess these perceptions of these broader systems. So sometimes it is a bit more challenging, these broader systems, to assess in like a quantitative way. So how can we understand how people perceive these broader structures? So we did our best to try to capture these systems. And what we wanted to see again was, would there be direct associations with bullying or indirect associations or both? What would we find with this? And again, we tried to focus more on these kind of antisocial traits that have been related to bullying in the past. So the data for this study came from the Brock Adolescent Development Study. So it was a cross-sectional sample of about 400 young people who we recruited from local extracurricular groups. So we tried to get a range. We had sports groups, but we also had like church groups, after school activities, dance groups, and tried to get a big range of these different groups. And they completed these measures online. So in this study, we looked at different levels of the system. So we tried to look at microsystem, the mesosystem, exosystem, and so forth. And we conducted several models, but today I just wanted to present kind of like a summary of overall what we found across these. So for personality, we looked at the hexaco model of personality. So if you're unfamiliar with this model, it's a general personality model like the Big Five. And it has this additional sixth factor called honesty, humility, where at the lower end, if someone's lower on honesty, humility, then they're probably more kind of exploitative, they're less sincere, they're immodest. Whereas if you rate higher on this trait, you're more sincere, more humble, more genuine, and more pro-social. So we looked at personality. We also looked at the microsystem. We looked at parenting. We also tried to look at assessments of these interactions in the mesosystem. So school discipline, for instance, asking things like, how do teachers interact with your peers? And then we had at the exosystem, perceptions of neighborhood or community violence. And what we found were these direct effects again. So each of these kind of variables were related to bullying in the expected directions in a direct pattern, but we found evidence for indirect pathways again through personality. So for example, lower levels of parental knowledge was one of the parenting factors, was related to higher, lower honesty, humility, and that in turn was related to bullying. So again, showing these indirect pathways of how these broader factors are related to more immediate factors and indirectly impacting bullying as well. And another thing we tried to look at was, okay, so we have these indirect pathways, but what about those interactive effects, those moderation associations? So we picked up on that parental knowledge component, and we tried to see if this would interact with personality as well. And what we found was that that association between being exploitative and higher levels of bullying were significant only when parental knowledge was low or moderate, meaning if parents were less aware of what their child was involved in, we found that personality was more strongly related to bullying behavior. So again, kind of speaking to that complexity of there are these direct pathways, there are these indirect pathways, but there's also these interactive effects. So it's not just as simple of who's using bullying or when are they using bullying, but this interaction of it really involves both, how people are interacting with their social environment. So kind of up until now, a lot of my research has focused on these individual differences and then more of the social environmental factors at that immediate system. So more the microsystem, a little bit of the mesosystem, but really I think there's a lot of room for understanding these broader systems. So how can we best capture, for example, these cultural and social attitudes at the macrosystem level? So it is challenging, as I said earlier on, to measure these from a kind of quantitative perspective, and perhaps maybe there are alternate ways that we have to measure this to better understand what's going on, how young people perceive these structures. There's a lot of work on, for example, attitudes towards underrepresented, diverse, and marginalized groups. How are these structures impacting how young people experience their social world and when bullying is being used? Also, at that broadest level, the changes across time in the chronosystem, we all are still going through the COVID pandemic. And how are these large changes or large events also impacting all of these other systems and how young people are related to bullying? So I think this is something that I would like to continue researching more in the future and getting to understand how this interacts with these more immediate or immediate systems or individual differences. But I wanted to present results from one study, which I thought kind of started to capture a little bit of these macro chrono changes. So this is a study that I had the opportunity to work on with Tracy Vinecourt, Heather Britton, Amanda Kreisman, Sally Landon, and Deb Pepler during the COVID pandemic. So we were trying to see what are the prevalence rates of bullying like during the pandemic, at least in relation to prevalence rates before the pandemic. So this study, we wanted to see the prevalence rates. It was a cross-sectional sample of students from grade 4 to grade 12 in Ontario. And we were trying to also look at what were known modifiers with respect to gender, grade, and underrepresented population. So can we see what those prevalence rates were like? And this study was conducted in the fall of 2020 when schools were back in person. They had the option to attend online, but the majority were back in person. But we also had all these other restrictions like physical distancing, classroom sizes, and so forth. So we thought potentially that maybe the prevalence rates could have been lower despite being in person due to all of these kind of changes going on. So in this study, there were over 6,000 students, and the students were randomized into responding about bullying either during the pandemic, that fall 2020 time, or the year previous, so 2019 to 2020 before the pandemic. So we were trying to see what were the prevalence rates like across these two conditions. And what we found was that generally prevalence rates were a lot lower during the COVID current condition than before COVID. So kind of supporting that idea, well, maybe a lot of these changes are limiting the possibility for bullying experiences. So victimization and perpetration levels in across all the forms that were assessed were a lot lower. But what was really kind of noteworthy when we were looking at these kind of modifiers was that even though generally victimization rates were lower during COVID, we found that it was still high for young people who reported identifying with diverse groups with respect to sexual identity and gender identity. So something's going on here where generally everyone was reporting lower levels of victimization, but for these underrepresented groups, they were still reporting higher levels. And that makes you wonder, like, what's going on in our societal structures that are still related to these types of experiences? And how does that interact with something like the pandemic, which is a big event that everyone's going through? So I thought that this was interesting in showing that kind of interaction between those broader systems, but I would really like to dive into that deeper and trying to understand what is going on at these broadest levels and how are those then impacting our immediate social systems and in turn use of bullying behavior. So of course, across all these studies, there are some limitations, and that hopefully can continue researching in the future, in particular, really trying to look at these associations longer term. So how can we measure and assess and understand all of these systems across time, the changes across these systems, and what are these mechanisms that are at play across this longer time span? Also important to understand the long-term outcomes of bullying perpetration. So I think there are some studies that do show perpetration is related to different forms of violence and aggression in adulthood, whether it's workplace violence, dating violence, or sexual harassment, and trying to see, are these associations also based on different contextual factors and individual differences, and how can we best prevent all of these forms of violence as early as we can? And then I'm very interested to see how these factors come into play for diverse and underrepresented populations. So are there qualitative differences? Are there quantitative differences? And what do those patterns look like in experiences of both perpetration, but also victimization as well? So I know there was a lot of findings and studies and lots going on, but taking it all together, what does it all mean and how can we use this information in a practical sense to mitigate these factors and hopefully reduce bullying, perpetration, and experiences of victimization? So this leads to the third learning objective on reflecting about these implications and what it means to mitigate these factors and also reduce and prevent bullying. So I think first, trying to think about what the implications are will be important for thinking about what the next step should be on that practical sense of how we can apply these findings. So first, I think across these studies, those first set of studies are showing that a small proportion of young people may continue to use bullying in the long term. And maybe it is also related to these antisocial traits or certain levels of personality traits. But often these associations can be moderated or mediated by the social environment. So we have to see the context in which these forms of behavior are changing, these individuals are developing. And so perhaps it is important to address those cognitions and attitudes and tendencies related to things like self-regulation or lack of sensitivity to other people. But we still know not all young people are using bullying all the time. What are these contextual factors that we need to combine with understanding the important skills that we can help to reduce bullying? So traits and behavior are all shaped by the environment. Young people are living in social worlds. How can we impact these climates to make them more pro-social, to reduce the need to have to use bullying the best that we can? And how can we support vulnerable youth and provide them with good quality support, but also helping develop skills for positive interpersonal relationships? So in that idea of trying to increase pro-social climate and try to reduce the need for bullying, I wanted to present one study that we conducted where we were looking at the different social resources that could be related to bullying perpetration versus victimization versus pro-social behavior. And in this study, we looked at social dominance as well as alliance formation. So social dominance in the sense of what's traditionally been related to bullying. So trying to have that social power or social status. But we also looked at alliance formation, which is slightly different. So in the literature, the idea of alliance formation is like people you want to form alliances with or work together with. Like you want to be a part of their team because they seem like people that you respect, which is slightly different than perhaps being fearful or afraid of certain people who have this social power. So we were trying to see, well, are they differentially related to bullying perpetration versus victimization and pro-social strategies? We also looked at interactions with pro-social strategies because some people may be able to use bullying, but also be pro-social depending on the context. And what we found was that bullying was related to social dominance only. So higher bullying, higher social dominance. And dominance was related to alliance formation, but with bullying perpetration, we only found that one direct effect. Unfortunately, victimization was related to lower alliance formation. But what we thought was kind of the unique part of these results was that pro-social strategies were related to both. It was related to alliance formation, but also social dominance. So not only are you, if you're pro-social, you may potentially have this kind of social, let's say like assertiveness, but people also still want to work with you. So we thought that these findings could have some implications for interventions because if some people are using bullying under certain contexts because they can gain things like social status, well, if pro-social strategies, you can gain that plus other social kind of outcomes, then perhaps we really need to focus on how we can best facilitate these contexts so that we don't need to use bullying for positive outcomes, and how can we encourage pro-social behavior and strategies. And there are so many great interventions and prevention research and programs that are out there. I think that they really highlight the different ways we can apply research findings. There's lots of great research by some people in the Alberti Center on like social emotional programs or bystander interventions. And I always love learning about these programs and seeing how we can make that connection between research and practice. And there are other programs that are out there that do focus primarily on pro-social climates or relationship formation, but I think that idea of integrating across, like trying to get peers to intervene with bystander roles or how can we make sure that bullying is not rewarded or reinforced. I think there are so many areas that have done great work on this, and hopefully my research will make some sort of impact on these areas of the already amazing work that's been going on with these programs and practices. So finally, I just wanted to acknowledge all of the people that made this research possible. So starting with all the participants, their involvement and willing to share their experiences, my colleagues at the University of Ottawa and at Brock University as well, and then all of the funders who made this research possible. And then finally, I just wanted to say that we just developed a bullying research group at Brock, comprised of myself, Dr. Naomi Andrews, Dr. Drew Dane, and Tony Wolf across child abuse studies and psychology. And if anyone's interested, we've got some research, a link up there. And finally, just wanted to say thank you again for everyone attending both virtually and in person. And looking forward to hearing any feedback or thoughts you may have had. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I can't believe you're an early career scholar. Like that, all the longitudinal and the late in class and the way that you're looking at all of these different contexts is absolutely it's great work. I'm wondering, I'm going to open it up, and we've got a lot of thank yous in the chat, but open it up for any questions from either folks here and or online. Some folks here have questions or comments for Dr. Farrell.
I can start us off. So first, I would just like to echo what Dr. Nickerson just said. Just really wonderful presentation, and the studies that you have conducted are incredibly impressive in terms of the rigor of both the methodology and the statistical analyses that you've been able to be a part of with these studies. So, so really kudos to you and your teams that you've been working with. I guess one of my questions is maybe related to maybe some of the how some of the constructs, particularly with personality traits, how they're measured. So I think I'm much less familiar with how measuring first bullying perpetration is. I think I'm much more familiar with measuring sort of the victimization side of things. And then the personality traits. So I think it's so interesting, the work that you were doing or that you were talking about with like narcissism and how that's related to bullying perpetration. And I guess I'm just wondering, I think you had mentioned that they were self-report. And I guess my first thought was, I'm just wondering how like self-aware a child or even adolescent might be about some of their personality traits. And has that, I guess, come into play at all with some of the constructs that you've been measuring? Has that been sort of an issue, or how do you overcome some of that? And I guess some of that self-awareness piece with the developmental, differences, if you could speak to a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it's something that I even think about in how I conceptualize personality or temperament or individual differences. And that idea of, so in like previous researchers who have done a lot of work on like the measure development and scale validity and reliability, they do talk about how traits like narcissism or some of the more like dark triad or those types of like more socially advanced traits, that you can't really measure it until that aspect has developed. So you need that social experience in order to have these traits be evident. And I think those measures often say like around age 8 to 10 is when we can even see these types of traits, because you need that social interaction, that social input. So I think that's an important question, because it really depends what traits you want to look at. So like a lot of the younger age groups, like when we were looking at the earlier predictors, we focus more on those temperament traits that have been more reliably measured from early in development. with different measures for like infancy versus childhood or adolescence. So I think it just depends on the trait that you're interested in seeing the developmental change for, and then just being aware of which types of self-report you're using. So when we select measures, really trying to select measures that have a lot of evidence for reliability and validity, especially with traits like narcissism. We use the narcissistic personality questionnaire, which was specifically for like children and adolescents. So just making sure the measures are developmentally appropriate. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Very impressive and relate to your kind of one of the papers relate to the differences between the pre-COVID and the after COVID. I'm just wondering how you're measuring the cyberbullying for your study, and also because you collected real-time data, kind of large scale data. So I'm wondering whether you make your data available for the public use. But it depends on your kind of country.
Yeah. So the first, sorry, what was the first? So we actually use the same measure for bullying, perpetration, and victimization. So the study was led by Dr. Vinecourt, and she selected the same measures as her previous studies for that reason, to make sure it's not like just a COVID, like a fact of COVID, but trying to compare prevalence rates from previous studies where they use the exact same measure. So the cyber part was just one item. So typically we use like a composite of all of the different forms. But in the COVID study, we looked at prevalence overall, but also for each form just to see. And we weren't sure what would happen with the cyber one because it was like they had a lot of online experiences as well. But for all of the forms, they all showed lower levels during COVID. And we were thinking maybe it does have something to do with kind of like that supervision piece. But yeah, so it was the same measure, single items for each form, and the patterns were the same across all. I don't believe the data are publicly available, but I mean, if anyone's, I guess, has questions about this study, you could, of course, like contact Dr. Blackwood as well. But yeah, because her group led the study for that one.
We have a couple questions from people online. The first one, and I realize this might be challenging because I don't know that it's directly related to your research, but you might have thoughts about, the question is, how can the bullying cycle within a family be broken? Meaning children who are bullies who may have been bullied by their parents. I wonder if any of your work from the systems perspective and personality might be able to speak to that.
Yeah, I feel like that's such a good question, and that can be answered from so many like perspectives. And just from my like research experience, I feel like there are so many social relationships and social environments that are important in a child or developing person's life, that I wonder if also support from like that school context or with peers or other adults in a person's life that can also contribute to their development would be important. Specifically in the family context, I'm not too sure, but I'm just thinking of all of the factors that come into play and how maybe I really feel like that social support is so important. That piece, whether it's other adults in that person's life, whether it's at school or teachers or other peers. And I think having those relationships would be really important.
Great, thank you. And then we have someone complimenting you on your presentation and the multifaceted approach that you take. And he was commenting that at the end of the presentation, you highlighted how supporting the development of pro-social behaviors may mitigate the reinforcing factors of bullying prevention through dominance and alliance. Mm-hmm. And then his question was, do you have any thoughts about how varying levels of social emotional competence, like the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learnings framework, how they might relate to these concepts of dominance and alliance?
Yeah, I think that's an important question for really showing like that research and practice really needing to work together. And I'm just thinking like from that social emotional learning perspective, I think if you're able to have these skills and like have the opportunity to practice it in a supportive environment, I think that would first of all encourage people to be pro-social, but I think it would also help people, it would discourage them from trying to be aggressive or using bullying behavior. So if everyone is being supportive and getting along, let's say in a classroom, like, and that's the norm, you don't want to go against that social norm versus if it's a more kind of unsupportive, more aggressive climate, then that behavior is going to be kind of accepted or not even accepted, like tolerated, that people are going to be using that. So I would imagine that if we're trying to encourage pro-social climates with supportive relationships, more people are going to want to try to facilitate that alliance formation or that cooperation among peers rather than having this kind of hierarchical structure where only a few people are dominant or only a few people are kind of, I guess, rewarded with status or power. And I think there's some really great studies out there that use like that social networking perspective to look at different levels of status hierarchy versus cooperation. And I think those studies probably will do a better job at explaining and kind of seeing the practical standpoint, but that's kind of where I was thinking with that study. Like if we're seeing these relationships with pro-social behavior, then how can we encourage that instead of creating a norm of aggression or bullying?
And kind of related to that, with that study looking at dominance, both pro-social behavior and bullying perpetration predicted. So I guess, is the dominance, is the way that it was looked at, is that a negative character? Like, is it dominant at the expense of others, or is it dominant / leadership? Or
yeah, I think that's a good point too. I think so. In the measure that we use, we were trying to develop actually the co-author on the stage, Drew Ding, he was actually trying to develop these measures based on existing measures of what kind of would be the best way to capture dominance. And in this study, it ended up being more so I guess more centrality, that aspect of dominance. But I think it would depend on how you're measuring it. Is it like more the social kind of assertiveness, or is it like dominance, like you said, kind of at the expense of others not being on that hierarchy? So I think that's an important question. Yeah, and how you conceptualize social dominance.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for like one other question. If nobody wants to be the one to ask once they hear that, but just wondering if there were any other questions or thoughts that people wanted to add. Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank you again. Oh, we have a fancy, thanks, Marie. We have a fancy QR code for the brief evaluation. So I know she sent the link in the chat for the online people, but those that are here, if maybe that's what you're already doing, doing that. And that, again, we would love everybody's feedback, but that's also particularly if you want the NASP CEUs. And in addition to a huge thank you again for Dr. Farrell, we have a just a small gift remembering you bring your time that you see. And just a couple announcements, and this kind of follows from some of the work that she presented. Our next colloquium on November 15th from 11:30 to 12:45 is actually going to be a safe space training for educators. So GLIS, Growing LGBTQ plus Youth Support of Western New York, is going to be providing that. And I think that Dr. Farrell's work really showed that our individuals that identify as LGBTQ plus are continuing to face a lot of these challenges, and there is a lot that we can be doing in our environments to be more inclusive and more sensitive. So hopefully that'll be a really nice follow-up that we'll be doing. And of course, our annual conference coming up very soon, Wednesday, October 12th, and we're focusing again on the systems level, centering diversity, equity, and inclusion to promote positive school culture and student well-being. And our keynote is Dr. Janine Jones from the University of Washington. And then we have a great panel of leaders, superintendents of schools, the chief of diversity officer in the city of Buffalo, president and CEO of Peaceful Schools, to really give us perspective on diversity, equity, and inclusion in different school environments. So that is at Classics Banquet Hall or Center in Amherst, New York, but also online for virtual attendees. So thank you all so much, and you're getting a lot of kudos.